The moment Olivia Winters slid into the sleek black car, she barely glanced at the man in the driver's seat. "Finally," she huffed, tossing her purse onto the seat beside her. "Can we please move?" "I am so late." The man in the driver's seat turned slightly, his chiseled jaw tightening as his piercing blue eyes studied her. "Excuse me?" His voice was deep, smooth, too polished for an Uber driver, but Olivia was too frazzled to notice. "Midtown, please," she said, strapping on her seatbelt. "And if you can take Fifth instead of Madison, I'd really appreciate it." For a beat, the man didn't move. Then, with an almost amused shake of his head, he shifted the car into drive and pulled into the bustling New York traffic. Olivia exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Worst day ever," she muttered to herself. "Sounds dramatic," the driver commented dryly. She shot him a look through the rearview mirror. "You have no idea." "Try me," Olivia sighed. "Let's see." "My boss, who, by the way, is the devil in heels, decided today would be a great day to dump a last-minute presentation on me. My rent went up by $300. And to top it all off, my best friend bailed on our dinner plans, so now I'm going to this fancy work gala alone." The man hummed, his fingers tapping against the expensive leather steering wheel. "Sounds rough," she scoffed. "Rough is an understatement." "I need a miracle." A small silence stretched between them before the driver finally asked, "And what exactly would this miracle look like?" She let out a short laugh. "Oh, I don't know. A rich stranger sweeping me off my feet and telling me I never have to worry about money or my awful boss ever again." Amusement flickered in his gaze. "That's oddly specific." Olivia leaned her head back against the seat with a dramatic sigh. "A girl can dream." They drove in silence for a moment before she frowned, finally taking a good look at the car's interior. The seats were buttery soft, the dashboard sleek and high-tech. There was a faint, expensive cologne lingering in the air. "Fancy car for an Uber," she murmured. The driver's lips twitched. "It's not an Uber." Her stomach dropped. "What? This isn't an Uber," he repeated. "You got into the wrong car." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God." She sat up straight, completely horrified. "Oh my God." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. He was devastatingly handsome, strong jaw, broad shoulders, and an air of authority that definitely didn't belong to a ride-share driver. She gasped. "Are you kidnapping me?" He let out a low chuckle. "If I were, I wouldn't still be driving toward Midtown, would I?" Her cheeks flamed. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." She grabbed her purse, her fingers shaking. "I'll get out at the next light, relax," he said smoothly. "I'll drop you off." Olivia hesitated, then slowly sank back into the seat. "I am never going to live this down." The man glanced at her, his eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "Probably not," she groaned, covering her face with her hands. "I've officially hit rock bottom." The car slowed as he pulled up in front of a grand hotel, the venue for her gala. When she reached for the door handle, she paused, glancing at him. "I really am sorry. Thank you for not calling the cops on me," he smirked. "You're welcome." She hesitated. "What's your name?" He seemed to consider for a moment before replying. "James." "Well, James, thank you for the ride." She stepped out of the car and hurried toward the entrance, her heart still racing. She'd probably never see him again, but something about the way he'd looked at her, the way his voice had wrapped around her name, sent a strange shiver down her spine. Little did she know, James wasn't just any man. He was James Calloway, Billionaire CEO, one of the most powerful men in New York, and he wasn't done with her yet. The moment Olivia stepped into the grand ballroom, she regretted everything. The chandeliers dripped with crystals, casting golden light onto the elegantly dressed crowd. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hushed conversations, the kind only the wealthy could afford to have, low, deliberate, and brimming with quiet power. She tugged at the hem of her navy gown, suddenly aware of how out of place she felt. Her boss, Victoria Langford, stood near the center of the room, effortlessly commanding attention in a sleek black dress. Olivia exhaled, squared her shoulders and walked toward her, preparing for whatever passive-aggressive comments the woman had in store for her tonight. "You're late," Victoria said as soon as Olivia approached, not bothering with pleasantries. "There was traffic," Olivia lied smoothly. No way was she going to explain the whole mistaken car fiasco. Victoria's gaze swept over her, cool and assessing. "Try not to embarrass yourself tonight. The Calloway deal is more important than you can possibly imagine." Olivia nodded, though she knew she wouldn't be involved in any high-stakes negotiations. She was here as an accessory, someone to smile, nod, and make sure Victoria's drink was always full. The Calloway deal had been the talk of the office for months, a potential merger with Calloway Industries that could elevate Langford PR to new heights. She turned toward the bar, needing a moment to relax before the night truly began. As she waited for her drink, a presence settled beside her, a man, tall and composed. "You clean up well," a familiar voice murmured. Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned her head. James. He was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, the crisp lines of his suit emphasizing his broad shoulders. He looked like he belonged here, like he was at home in this world of wealth and power. Her breath hitched. "You," his lips twitched. "Me." "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He lifted a glass of whiskey to his lips, watching her over the rim. "I was invited." Her pulse pounded. Of course he was invited. He had the confidence of someone important, someone who didn't need permission to be anywhere. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait. Who are you exactly?" James tilted his head, as if considering whether to answer. Then, as if deciding it would be more fun to let her figure it out, he simply said, "I told you my name." She exhaled sharply. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Mr. Calloway?" Olivia turned just as Victoria approached, her usual air of superiority momentarily replaced with something resembling respect. "Calloway." Her stomach flipped. James Calloway. She almost choked on her drink. The billionaire. The man at the center of the very deal her company was desperate to land, and she'd mistaken him for an Uber driver. James, completely unfazed, gave Victoria a polite nod. "Miss Langford." Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. "I hope you're enjoying the event." "We're honored to have you here tonight." James hummed in response, but his gaze remained on Olivia, amusement flickering in his eyes. He was enjoying this. Victoria followed his gaze, her expression tightening when she realized who he was looking at. "Olivia," she said, her tone clipped. "Why don't you stay?" James interrupted smoothly. Victoria blinked. "I beg your pardon." James set his glass down and turned fully toward Olivia as if she were the only person in the room. "I'd like to speak with Miss Winters for a moment, if you don't mind." Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to appease him and not understanding why he wanted anything to do with Olivia. Finally, she forced a tight smile. "Of course." The moment Victoria walked away, Olivia let out a breath. "Enjoying yourself?" James asked, his tone laced with quiet amusement. She groaned. "Not one word," he smirked, "not even a small one. This is mortifying. I think it's refreshing." She shot him a look. "You would." James studied her for a moment, his amusement fading slightly. "You don't like these kinds of events, do you?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't belong here." His gaze darkened, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Who told you that?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, I don't know, the dress code, the price of a single drink. The way everyone looks at me like I'm someone's assistant instead of an actual guest." James leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't let them make you feel small. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the room faded away, leaving just the two of them. Then, as if sensing she needed space, James straightened. "Dance with me," she blinked. "What?" He extended a hand. "Dance with me." Olivia hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was a request or a challenge, but either way, she found herself slipping her hand into his. He led her onto the dance floor, his movements smooth and assured. He placed a hand on her waist and she rested hers on his shoulder. The music swelled around them, and suddenly she was moving with him, his lead effortless, controlled. "Is this your way of making me forget how embarrassing tonight has been?" she asked. James chuckled. "Is it working?" She wanted to say no, but the warmth of his hand on her waist, the way his thumb brushed against the fabric of her dress, made it impossible to think about anything else. For the first time that night, she didn't feel out of place. She felt like she belonged. And that terrified her. The waltz came to an end, but James didn't immediately release her. His grip remained firm yet effortless, his thumb tracing idle patterns along the back of her hand. Olivia felt the weight of his gaze, the quiet intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Around them, the ballroom guests had shifted their attention elsewhere, but she was acutely aware of how many eyes had been on them just moments ago. James finally stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." There was no urgency in his voice, yet the way he said it made refusal feel impossible. Olivia hesitated for only a second before nodding. He led her through the sea of glittering guests, past murmured conversations and knowing glances. They stepped out onto a quiet balcony overlooking the city, the cool night air wrapping around them. She leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. "Do you always make a habit of whisking people away from crowded rooms?" James leaned beside her, his posture relaxed, but there was something calculating about the way he studied her. "Not usually." She glanced sideways at him. "Then why me?" A slow smile tugged at his lips. "You intrigue me." Olivia's stomach did something ridiculous, but she ignored it. "Because I mistook you for a driver?" His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Because you don't pretend," she frowned. "Pretend what?" "That you belong here." He turned to look at her fully. "Most people in that room spend their entire lives trying to prove they deserve a seat at the table. You, on the other hand, walked in knowing you didn't care to have one." Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but she hesitated. He wasn't wrong. She hadn't come here to impress anyone. She'd come because she had to, because it was expected. "That doesn't mean I don't want to succeed," she said carefully. James nodded as if he already knew that. "But you'd rather do it on your own terms." She studied him, the way the city lights reflected in his eyes, the way he seemed both completely at ease and entirely unreadable. "And what about you?" she asked. "Do you belong here?" For the first time that evening, something in his expression shifted. It was brief, a flicker of something like hesitation, but it was gone before she could fully register it. "I've spent my whole life in rooms like this," he said. Belonging was never a choice. There was something in the way he said it, the quiet resignation beneath his words, that made Olivia pause. She had assumed he thrived in this world, that he moved through it effortlessly. But now she wasn't so sure. Before she could press further, the balcony doors swung open. James, a tall, impeccably dressed woman, strode toward them, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Her hair was swept into a sleek-up doe, and her emerald gown shimmered under the dim light. There was something sharp about her beauty, polished, deliberate. James straightened slightly, his expression unreadable once again. "Vivian." Olivia immediately recognized the name. Vivian Kensington, heiress to one of the most powerful media empires in the country. More importantly, she was the woman tabloids had been linking to James for months. Vivian barely spared Olivia a glance before turning her attention back to James. "I've been looking for you everywhere." James didn't react. I've been occupied. Vivian's gaze flickered toward Olivia, assessing her in a way that made it clear she was already dismissing her. I need a moment, she said, her voice smooth but firm. Olivia took that as her cue to leave. She turned to James, offering a polite nod. Thanks for the dance. He hesitated, but then gave her a small, almost reluctant nod. Olivia. She stepped past Vivian, who didn't bother hiding her curiosity, and made her way back inside. As soon as she re-entered the ballroom, she regretted it. Victoria was waiting for her, arms crossed, irritation clear on her face. What exactly do you think you're doing? Victoria asked, keeping her voice low but firm. Olivia blinked. What? Victoria gestured toward the balcony. I just watched you dance with James Calloway and then disappear with him. Do you have any idea how delicate this deal is? Olivia stiffened. I wasn't trying to. I don't care what you were trying to do, Victoria cut in. I need him focused on the merger, not distracted by some side interest. Heat rushed to Olivia's cheeks. Side interest? Victoria's stare was razor sharp. You don't belong in his world, Olivia. Don't make the mistake of thinking otherwise. Olivia clenched her jaw. I'm here because of my job, not because of him. Victoria arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Then act like it. With that, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd. Olivia exhaled sharply, her hands tightening at her sides. The night had taken a turn, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. She had no intention of getting involved with James Calloway. But something told her it wasn't going to be that simple. Olivia maneuvered through the glittering crowd, her pulse still unsteady from the confrontation with Victoria. She needed air. Not the crisp night chill of the balcony, where James and Vivian were no doubt engaged in a conversation she had no business caring about, but space somewhere free of pointed stares and whispered assumptions. She spotted a quiet hallway near the back of the ballroom, lined with gilded sconces casting warm light over the polished floors. She ducked into it, exhaling sharply. This world, it wasn't hers. She had been reminded of that twice in the span of minutes, once by Victoria's cold words, and again by the effortless way Vivian had inserted herself between James and Olivia, as if correcting a mistake. And maybe it had been a mistake. She pressed her fingers to her temple, willing herself to shake it off. This night, this event, it wasn't about James Calloway, it was about work. About proving herself in a way that had nothing to do with stolen dances or intense conversations on balconies. A sound behind her made her turn. James. He stood at the entrance to the hallway, his expression unreadable. He had his hands in his pockets, his posture deceptively casual, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. You left, he said. Olivia straightened. I wasn't aware I needed to stay. His gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through it. That's not what I meant. She crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. Then what did you mean? James took a measured step closer. Vivian can be insistent. Olivia let out a short laugh, though it held little humor. Is that what we're calling it? A muscle in his jaw tightened. If she said something, she didn't have to, Olivia cut in. She walked onto that balcony knowing exactly who she was and exactly who I wasn't. James exhaled, slow and steady. Vivian and I, we have history, but that's all it is. Olivia tilted her head, studying him. Why are you telling me this? Something shifted in his expression, something that made her stomach tighten. Because I don't want you making assumptions. She hesitated. I don't think my assumptions matter. They do, he said, his voice quieter now. She swallowed. James. He took another step toward her, and suddenly he was too close. Close enough that she could catch the faintest trace of cedar and something sharper, something uniquely him. Close enough that the noise of the gala faded into an afterthought. He studied her like he was trying to figure something out, like he wasn't used to being uncertain. Before either of them could say anything else, a voice echoed down the hall. There you are. Olivia turned just as Victoria appeared, her expression carefully composed but her eyes sharp. Whatever moment had just passed between Olivia and James shattered instantly. Victoria barely glanced at him before zeroing in on Olivia. "I need you in the ballroom." Olivia forced a nod, stepping back. James held her gaze for a beat longer before she turned away and followed Victoria back into the crowd. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite smiles and strategic conversations. Olivia kept her focus on work, on being exactly what she was supposed to be: professional, composed, invisible when necessary. James didn't approach her again that night, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, the tension that hadn't dissipated, and she hated how much she noticed. The night had ended with Olivia slipping into a cab alone, her thoughts tangled in a mess she hadn't asked for. James Calloway wasn't her problem. He wasn't supposed to be anything more than a name tied to a business deal she had no real stake in. But the heat in his gaze, the way he had stepped closer in the hallway, the way he had told her without hesitation that Vivian was his past. It sat in her chest like a weight she didn't know what to do with. She'd spent years keeping her life simple. Work, pay rent, try to survive in a city that didn't care if she sank or swam. And now, in the span of a single evening, James had thrown her off balance with nothing more than a dance and a few well-placed words. By the time she woke the next morning, she had convinced herself it was over. A bizarre, fleeting moment in a world she didn't belong to. She would go to work, bury herself in tasks, and pretend none of it had ever happened. It was a solid plan, until the email arrived. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she stared at the message sitting in her inbox, the subject line crisp and to the point: "Meeting request, James Calloway." Her pulse jumped. She hesitated before clicking it open. The email was brief. A meeting had been scheduled for that afternoon. Attendance was mandatory. She swallowed hard. There was no reason to assume this had anything to do with her. James Calloway was a businessman. This was business. Except she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. By the time Olivia arrived at the towering glass headquarters of Calloway Industries, she had managed to talk herself into a state of cautious detachment. She was here for work, nothing more. The conference room was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Victoria was already seated at the long table, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through something on her tablet. Other executives filled the space, their hushed conversations blending into the hum of the room. Then the door opened. James walked in, his presence shifting the air immediately. He was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, his expression calm but sharp. He exchanged a few words with one of his associates before his gaze landed on Olivia. Her stomach tightened. He took his seat at the head of the table, scanning the room before speaking. His voice was measured, controlled. The meeting unfolded with precision. Discussions of numbers, projections, the finer details of the impending merger. Olivia took notes, keeping her focus on the task at hand. She didn't look at him, didn't let herself get distracted. But then, near the end of the meeting, James shifted the conversation. His attention turned to Victoria. "I want Olivia assigned to the transition team." Her pen stilled against the page. Victoria's reaction was immediate, subtle but telling. A slight stiffening of her posture, a flicker of something sharp in her gaze. "That won't be necessary," Victoria said smoothly. "Olivia's current workload is already substantial." James didn't blink. "She's capable." Olivia's breath caught. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how these things worked. Victoria hesitated, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, if that's what you prefer." "It is." And just like that, it was done. The meeting wrapped up moments later. People gathered their things, exchanged polite farewells. Olivia was still seated when James approached her. He stopped beside her chair, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You'll be working closely with me. Her fingers curled around the edge of her notebook. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Why? A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. You intrigue me. Her pulse kicked up. She should have said something, should have pushed back, told him she wasn't a game to be played, but the words didn't come. Because the truth, the terrifying, undeniable truth, was that James Calloway intrigued her too. Olivia had barely stepped out of the conference room when Victoria's hand closed around her wrist, her grip deceptively light. Without a word, she steered Olivia into an empty office, the door clicking shut behind them. The moment they were alone, Victoria folded her arms, her eyes cold and assessing. What exactly do you think you're doing? Olivia pulled her arm free, straightening. I could ask you the same thing. Victoria's expression didn't change. James Calloway doesn't make decisions like this on a whim. He doesn't just take an interest in junior employees. Olivia's stomach twisted, but she kept her posture steady. Maybe he thinks I'm good at my job. Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, Olivia. He thinks you're interesting. She let the word hang between them, sharp and pointed, and that makes you a liability. Heat crept up Olivia's neck. That's not fair. What's not fair, Victoria said, stepping closer, is that I've spent months securing this merger and now I have to worry about whether or not you're going to get distracted. Olivia's jaw tightened. I won't. Victoria studied her for a long moment, then exhaled through her nose. I hope for your sake that's true. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left. Olivia stood there, her pulse hammering. She wanted to tell herself that Victoria was wrong, that James Calloway's decision had nothing to do with personal interest. But the way he had looked at her in that meeting, the quiet, deliberate way he had made sure she was part of his world, made it impossible to ignore. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she wanted to ignore it. The first day of working directly with James unfolded in a way Olivia hadn't expected. The transition team had been established, and as she settled into her new role, she quickly realized that James wasn't the type of CEO who sat back and let others handle things. He was involved, sharp, and completely unreadable. She spent most of the morning in meetings, absorbing information, taking notes, and trying to ignore the way James occasionally glanced in her direction. He didn't acknowledge their history, not the mistaken car ride, not the dance, not the tension that had crackled between them on the balcony. It was almost like none of it had happened. Almost. By the time noon hit, Olivia was drained. She had just stepped into the staff lounge to grab a coffee when she heard footsteps behind her. You look like you need something stronger than that. She turned to find James leaning casually against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. She forced a polite smile. It's been a long morning. He stepped inside, the air shifting between them. You're handling it well. She lifted a brow. Is that a compliment? He tilted his head slightly. Observation. She took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim. You don't treat me like the others. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Would you prefer I did? She hesitated. It would make things easier. James considered that for a moment before shaking his head slightly. I'm not interested in easy. Her pulse kicked up. What are you interested in? His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. Figuring that out. The air between them thickened, but before Olivia could respond, a voice interrupted them from the hallway. James, we need you in the boardroom. One of his executives stood at the entrance, waiting. James didn't take his eyes off Olivia immediately, but after a beat, he nodded and turned away. As he left, Olivia exhaled, gripping her coffee cup a little tighter. She had walked into this job thinking she could keep things professional. Now, she wasn't so sure. Olivia had spent the past week convincing herself that she could keep things professional. That working closely with James Calloway didn't mean anything beyond her career. That the way he watched her, the The way his presence shifted the air whenever he entered a room was just her imagination. But as she stood in the glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, with James only a few feet away, she knew she had been lying to herself. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting a golden hue over the space. James sat at the edge of his desk, reviewing a set of reports, his expression unreadable. He had called her in under the pretense of discussing transition details, but Olivia could sense something else simmering beneath the surface. She kept her posture poised, her hands lightly resting on the back of one of the leather chairs. "You wanted to go over something?" James glanced up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "I did." He set the papers aside, his focus now entirely on her. "Your work has been thorough, you're adapting quickly." She nodded, unsure where this was leading. "I appreciate that." A small pause. "Then, I have an event tomorrow evening, a private function, I need you there." Olivia blinked. "Me?" "Yes," she hesitated. "Will Victoria be attending?" His expression remained impassive. "No." Something about the certainty in his tone made the air between them shift. This wasn't a request from a CEO to an employee. It was something else. "You don't need me for this," she said carefully. James studied her as if weighing his response. "I want you there." Her breath caught, but she forced herself to remain composed. "James, I'm not asking as your boss." His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was undeniable. She should have said no, should have walked out of that office with her professional boundaries intact, but instead she found herself nodding. James's gaze held hers for a moment longer before he pushed off the desk. "I'll send a car for you." She turned toward the door, but before she could leave, he spoke again. "Olivia," she glanced back, his expression was unreadable. "Don't overthink it." Easy for him to say. The next evening, Olivia stood in front of a grand estate just outside the city, her heart pounding harder than it should have been. The car had dropped her off at the entrance, where doormen in crisp black suits guided her into the sprawling mansion. She had expected a large, impersonal gathering, something business-related, but what she walked into was something far more intimate. The space was filled with only a handful of guests, all of whom radiated wealth and power in a way that made Olivia's stomach tighten. She barely had time to absorb her surroundings before she felt him. James was across the room, speaking with an older man whose presence commanded attention. But the moment Olivia stepped inside, his eyes found her. The conversation around him didn't falter, but Olivia saw the slight shift in his stance, the flicker of something in his gaze. Then, without hesitation, he excused himself and walked toward her. "You came." Something about the way he said it sent an unexpected thrill down her spine. "You didn't give me much of a choice." His lips twitched slightly. "Didn't I?" Before she could respond, the older man James had been speaking with approached. He was tall, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his movements deliberate. "James," the man said smoothly. "Aren't you going to introduce me?" James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he gestured toward Olivia. "This is Olivia Winters." The man extended a hand. "Richard Calloway." Olivia froze. Calloway, as in James's family. She shook his hand, keeping her expression neutral. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Richard's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Likewise, you must be someone important if my son brought you here." Her pulse jumped. Son, James's father. James's expression didn't change, but Olivia could feel the tension radiating from him. "She's part of the transition team," James said evenly. Richard raised a brow. "Interesting." He turned back to Olivia. "I wasn't aware the transition team required personal invitations to events like this." Olivia opened her mouth, unsure how to respond, but James stepped in smoothly. "It does when I say it does." His tone was calm, but the undercurrent of warning was unmistakable. Richard held his gaze for a moment before offering Olivia a polite smile. "I hope you enjoy the evening." Then, just as smoothly as he had arrived, he walked away. Olivia exhaled, turning to James. "That was unavoidable," James finished, his expression unreadable. She hesitated. "He doesn't approve, does he?" James's gaze darkened slightly. "My father doesn't approve of anything that isn't his idea." She studied him, the way his shoulders had tensed slightly, the way his jaw had tightened. She had assumed James Calloway was untouchable, that nothing could shake him. But now, standing here, she realized something else. James might have built an empire, but the weight of his last name still followed him, and she had just stepped into the middle of it. The evening stretched on, the weight of Richard Calloway's scrutiny still lingering in Olivia's mind. But James didn't let it show. If he was affected by his father's presence, he didn't acknowledge it, steering her through the gathering with the same effortless confidence he always carried. But she could sense the tension beneath it. The way his grip on the stem of his glass was just a little too firm. The way his gaze lingered on his father across the room, as if waiting for the next inevitable move. James Calloway was a man who controlled everything around him. But tonight, Olivia realized there were some things even he couldn't dictate. As the evening began winding down, James caught her wrist, his touch light but deliberate. He leaned in, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Come with me." She hesitated only for a second before nodding. James led her through a side entrance, out onto a stone pathway lined with lanterns casting a soft golden glow. The estate grounds stretched before them, quiet and removed from the calculated elegance of the party inside. She inhaled the crisp night air, grateful for the space between them and the world they had just stepped out of. James loosened the collar of his shirt slightly, rolling his shoulders. "I wasn't expecting him to be here tonight." Olivia didn't need to ask who he meant. "Does it matter?" His lips pressed together briefly. "It always matters." She studied him, the way the tension still lingered in the set of his jaw. "You don't have to prove anything to him." Something flickered in his gaze before he exhaled slowly, his fingers raking through his hair. "It's not about proving anything. It's about the fact that no matter what I build, his shadow is always there." Olivia hesitated before stepping closer. "Then stop letting it cast over you." His gaze snapped to her, something unreadable passing through it. "It's not that simple." She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't it?" James let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You make it sound easy." She searched his face. "Maybe it's not about easy. Maybe it's about deciding what's worth fighting for." His expression shifted, something rower surfacing beneath the polished exterior. "And what if I've already decided?" Her breath caught. The space between them felt smaller now, the air charged with something unspoken. James lifted a hand, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers barely grazing her skin. "You walked into my world without knowing what it was, and somehow you've managed to see through it better than anyone else ever has." Her pulse pounded. "James," but he didn't let her finish. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't care about the merger. I don't care about the expectations. The only thing I care about right now is you." A shiver ran through her, not from the cold but from the sheer intensity of his words. She could have denied it. Could have told him it was too complicated, that they were from different lives, different worlds. But it would have been a lie, because somewhere along the way she had fallen. She had fallen for the man she had mistaken for a stranger, the man who had turned out to be so much more. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to admit it. So instead of pulling away, she met him halfway, and when his lips finally found hers, it felt inevitable. The kiss unraveled everything. It wasn't tentative or uncertain, it was a collision, a silent declaration that neither of them could take back. James's hands settled at her waist, steadying her as if she were something worth holding on to. Olivia's fingers curled into the fabric of his suit, her entire world narrowing to the warmth of his touch, the undeniable certainty in the way he kissed her. The night air wrapped around them, but Olivia barely felt it. Every inch of her was consumed by him, the way his lips moved against hers, the way his grip tightened slightly, like he had been holding himself back for far too long. When they finally broke apart, her breath was unsteady, her heart racing. James didn't step away. His forehead rested against hers for a fleeting moment, his breathing just as uneven. She had no words, no ability to process what had just happened. But James didn't need words. His fingers brushed along her jaw, his gaze searching hers as if trying to memorize every detail. Then, as if the world had been waiting for the perfect moment to intrude, the distant sound of voices carried from the estate. The evening's event was winding down, the controlled murmur of high society guests signaling the return to reality. James exhaled, the reluctant weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. Olivia felt it too, the shift, the reminder of where they were, of the lines that had been crossed. But she didn't regret it, not for a second. James straightened, his hand slipping from her waist but not completely letting go. His thumb brushed against her wrist, a silent reassurance. Neither of them spoke as they walked back toward the house. The world around them hadn't changed, but something between them had, something irreversible. As they stepped inside, James's father was waiting. Richard Calloway stood near the entrance, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of them together. Olivia felt the weight of his scrutiny, the calculated way his gaze flickered between her and James. James didn't falter. His grip on Olivia's hand remained firm, a silent message that didn't need to be spoken. Richard's lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile, not approval, not disapproval. Just acknowledgement. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Olivia exhaled, the moment settling heavily in her chest. James glanced at her, his voice low. "He'll have opinions." She managed a quiet breath. "I figured." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but it was laced with something deeper, something more serious. "Does it matter to you?" Olivia met his gaze, searching for the answer she already knew. No, because this, whatever it was between them, wasn't about the expectations of others. It wasn't about business or power or the carefully controlled world James lived in. It was about them, and for the first time, that was all that mattered. The evening had shifted, the weight of unspoken truths finally lifted. Olivia stood beside James, the warmth of his presence steady against the cooling night. The estate buzzed with the last remnants of the evening's event, but they remained at the periphery, separate from the carefully crafted world inside. James had made a choice. Not one dictated by power or legacy, but by something far simpler, something undeniably real. And Olivia, despite every warning, every hesitation, had chosen him in return. As the last guests departed, James led her toward the waiting car, his touch light but deliberate. The ride back to the city was quiet, the hum of the road the only sound between them. But it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes, that didn't need to be filled with unnecessary words. When they arrived at her building, James stepped out first, opening the door for her. The gesture was effortless, natural, as if it had always been this way. Olivia hesitated for a breath before stepping onto the sidewalk, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She turned to him, the city lights casting a soft glow over his features. There was something in his expression, something unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before, and in that moment she knew this wasn't fleeting. It wasn't something that could be tucked away as a momentary indulgence. James Calloway, with all his wealth, his power, his carefully curated existence, he had let her in. and she had no intention of walking away. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. His grip tightened slightly, as if anchoring himself to the moment. No more barriers, no more worlds keeping them apart, just them. And for the first time, the future felt like something entirely their own.